So we have now heard the theory about gangs, and I will hear from Rafael Gude, who will talk about a case or study of transnational gangs. As I said, Rafael is a research fellow at the Social Change and Transgressive Studies Project at John Jay College. I understand Rafael will start by showing us a video, right, Rafael? But I leave the floor to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Miguel. Yeah, no, hello to everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me. Yeah, the idea behind this sort of the second part of the panel is to provide a sort of concrete case study of what Dave was talking about, right? If the gang is not pathological, and you can have different outcomes depending on the sort of political, social, economic conditions, what does that mean, right? If how have we seen that in recent times, and also part of this panel is about looking at transnational gangs, looking at different contexts. What can we learn from other countries? And so the idea here was to talk about the experience of the Latin kings, nietas, and masters, which are transnational gangs. At least the first two are transnational, and the Ecuadorian case. And this was very much inspired by our next speaker, King Tone, who did a lot to change the context in Ecuador. So I want to basically go into talking about the lessons, right, and give an example of what Dave was talking about. What does it mean to sort of have a different criminological imagination? But I feel like it might be useful to show a little video that we shot in Guayaquil during a Universal, which is a term that the Latin Kings use for their annual meetings. And Tone usually comes down every year and leads part of those meetings. So I wanted to sort of, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the lessons of looking at the gang as a collective, and what does it mean to create a political space for the gang to be transformed. But I think it's useful if you see the gang collectively in this short video, because I think it will help sort of inform how you listen to the presentation. So Omar, if you could put that video on, that would be great. Or Lindsay.
Most power groups, like we say, they think they're illiterate, but most of them got lessons. They got literature that speaks of their story from when it started to the days of now. So we take the kids in these different power groups, be it Blood, Crips, or whatever, and instead of chasing them away from their lessons, the things that they believe in, the blood lessons, we bring them more to them. Because usually the writing is beautiful, is what we do that's not. We don't follow it. So we reconnect them with their forefathers and the ancients' past history of why they were formed. So we teach the gang to re-educate, put their traditions back into the method that give them unity, and then give them opportunity to evolve into working and doing the right way, so they don't lose their members to these traps and ruts in the neighborhood called drugs and all that. And you see that the gang starts empowering itself to try to find its way out so they could become that lighthouse that they always dreamed of. And this is where it starts. With unity comes power. With knowledge comes understanding. And not the fear of being united, but we don't let them get into that stinking thinking. So all right, that now you understand later. So now what the credible messenger does is not only tell him his message, he goes, you should try these other messages and you might find that you love art. You love to be a mechanic. You love to be a video specialist or rapper. But the point is, we push them into different doors so they could explore the original, what they want to find to be happy, to want to be successful, and to start learning that everybody moves forward. You're not Peter Pan. Don't stay stuck. You got to grow up out of this like you grow up from high school. So I think it's a unique way of saying that we give the power back to the people.
La nación crece así. Cuando la nación creen los líderes, como los líderes creen la nación, entendiendo, cuando caemos, caemos juntos, cuando lo paramos juntos.
Universal is when power groups come together once a year with only themselves to talk about their agenda, their strives, what they feeling is going, and have their votes for whatever the process is that they believe in a safe space. So that's what Manuel does every year, and the governor and everyone here, they give a safe space to the power groups where we come, and then every year we do the next year's schedule, the next year's coordination plans, what they asking for us as a power group, this community, and what we've been giving forth. What are our weaknesses? Where are our strengths? What are our problems? Where do we need to explore now to keep this peace and this newfound style of being a power group in your mind? All these small communities with different banners take the time to come to one place and unite their banner and make that one that says, hey, we are united, we are together, we celebrate the same way, and we're gonna come as a new force this year with this new agenda. And what do you think about it? So this is what a universal signifies. It's just where these people could share their ideas and really solidify their plans with celebrating with their people the goals they already met. So they celebrate their last year's goal, getting ready for the new year's goals. And this is what universal signify for these power groups. And we teach them to hell that keep good businesses in business and good brands strong, is bring the people together to celebrate, to hear each other, express each other, and most of all, give the news and the outcome and the outlet that you want to do as a group together, so they all know what goals they're shooting for in different roads in different towns, but they're all shooting for that same goal: unity, respect, honesty, unity, love, so they could keep the process moving forward. Credible messenger, like in DC, it's got a lighthouse in DC because we formulated a plan there that shows the whole method, how it works. Ecuador is the lighthouse to South America, and that unique relationship between school, community, church, and power group formulated something we never could imagine, where the group started evolving, where they made, just by getting the opportunity of the government accepting them as a legal organization, we could say 60% started automatically say we want to do positive things, we want to go the positive route. That was the unique part that we gave the gang, the power it needed to influence other members in it to follow the footsteps of the positive people that were thinking that the right route was to get involved with community and justice department and figure out a method to itself. Love and the patience to make a movement works better than a 9-month program. It doesn't resolve anything, a program. But a movement means we continue to grow, we continue to go. There's no end to this. We don't quit on you in 9 months because we think we fixed your mind that's been oppressed for 20 years, you get it? Don't fear the unity. Don't fear the power. Give it its direction so it knows where to aim itself.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. Yeah, so no, I wanted to show you guys that video because I think it's important. A lot of times we're doing these presentations about what's going on in other places, and it sounds so remote, so different. So I wanted to show that video so you guys could see, and hopefully talking about the case study of Ecuador helps to sort of elucidate a lot of things that Dave was talking about and the things that Tone will talk about. In the video, Tone makes a lot of important points, right? He says, you know, he's not talking about a 9-month program. You know, he's not talking about CBT projects for gang members. He's talking about a social movement. And he says something very important at the end. He says, don't fear the power of the gang, try to redirect it, right? And I think that's the lesson. And a lot of what I want to speak about today is about is continuing what Dave said, to really sort of, there are so many things we need to unlearn about the gang in order to create policies that actually work. In the 60s, we were talking about social workers. We weren't relying on police officers to resolve crime. We were thinking about crime completely differently, right? And then things changed, right? And then we led to mass incarceration. We let moral panics drive policy, and look where it's brought us, right? So I think it's and you know, in the 60s, you have these amazing examples of alternatives to gang policy, alternatives to punitive approaches. But I want to sort of highlight an example that happened in the 2000s and that continues today, and is a different country. But it also has to do with the transnational gang, and it has a transnational history behind it. But it's an experience that is very understudied and not well known, right? And so hopefully we can sort of elucidate. Hopefully this experience will help, you know, give people tools to think with, right? To think differently about the gang. Lindsay, if you could put the PowerPoint. My idea basically here is to talk a little bit about Ecuador, and basically, I don't want to spend too long on it because I really want to give time for discussion, but I want to go through sort of 7 main points, basically, right? One is looking at politics and gangs. The other is looking at collective desistance. Very often we think about desistance from crime as an individual project, but I want to sort of untangle that and convince you of something else. I also want to talk about what does it mean to re-signify the gang. I also want to talk about what is the gang, how does the gang understand this very lofty title of rule of law. I want to also unpack a little bit this or challenge the idea of transnational gangs as being exclusively pejorative. I want to talk about the importance of contingency to understanding different pathways or reimagining different political realities, and sort of build off of what Dave said. And then at the end, I want to quickly just talk about the role of educators, since a lot of those listening or who will be listening to this recording are educators themselves. So the first slide. So this is a picture of Rafael Correa with members of the Latin Kings. This is in Carondelet, which is like basically the White House in Quito, and he's putting up a gang sign. He has a big smile on his face. Some of these guys we've been working with for years. This was a photo that was taken in 2007 to inaugurate. You can see the guy in the white suit. His name is Justin. He's holding up the legalization, or holding up illegal documents, giving the gang what they call personalidad jurídica, like they're giving them an NGO status, basically. So they're celebrating, and they had a dinner or a lunch along with the president. And I'll talk a little bit about, I'll start off talking a bit about this political experience, this political experiment with Correa. Next slide. So why Ecuador? I already went over this, but basically this idea that Ecuador, I think, is a really interesting case study, and we wanted to give a sort of concrete case study that was also transnational, had a transnational story behind it, of a policy that was highly successful. In the case of Ecuador, it has had one of the sharpest and most sustained homicide drops in Latin America, and talking about how this policy was informed, right? It was really looking at security as development and looking at security as holistic, and making differentiations between gangs, organized crime, and really looking at engaging with the gang collectively as a form of conflict transformation, right? And I think a lot of times we forget the role that the state can play in transforming gangs. So I think, you know, this is just a few reasons of why Ecuador is a sort of important study to look at. Next slide. So politics and gangs. A big lesson from Ecuador is basically, what does it mean to get the politics right? What does it mean to create a sort of political space for the gangs to participate politically, and for them to transform themselves, right? Was it and a lot of this has to do also with the fact that Correa was an economist, right? He was very and he was not a guy he wasn't a Lula or somebody or an Evo Morales who had experience working with social movements. That really wasn't his thing. He was an academic, he was an economist, and this idea of legalizing gangs, legalization is sort of shorthand for a much more complex political policy towards looking at gangs collectively. And that really had to do with legalization, because he said, I can't deal with informal actors, right? I need you guys to be formal. The same thing that he was saying about, bringing people into the formal economy, right? He was really thinking in economic terms. So he said, okay, I can deal with you. I want to work with you guys, but you need to become formal actors. So I need you guys to get, you need to become an NGO. I need you guys to work to get, a legal status. And so the gangs began to enter this political process, formal and very transparent political process with the government. But the first step was to become formal political actors. So what does it mean to interact, right? I will sort of untangle this concept as the slides go on. But the real story here was, how do we interact formally with gangs? How do we bring them into the fold? How do we bring them under the wing of the state, right? And bring them out of the shadows. And it's kind of the same idea of legalizing drugs. It was the same thing of legalizing gangs. It was saying, okay, let's deal with this head on. Let's bring this out. And a lot of it had to do with realizing the limits of coercion, right? A lot of times I think we forget what state power works most smoothly when people consent to the political project instead of coercing them, right? And Correa came into power after probably a decade of the most turbulent or unstable political experience in Latin America. They still have the record for most presidents in a year. It was really, really politically unstable. You have this guy comes to power, and he creates this political project which they call the citizen revolution. And part of that was to say, okay, what does it mean to extend citizenship rights also to gangs, also to those on the margins, right? And the idea here was to say, okay, we can, if the gangs are a part of this political project, what sort of things can we achieve with them, right? What are things that we can offer? And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that the state has to realize that with the gangs, you have a lot to offer them, because these are really the sort of les miserables, right, of Latin America and of the world, and that the state can offer them job training programs, it can offer them scholarships, it can invest in their communities. You can do a lot to address the ecology where the gang comes out, right? Basically, Correa uses his immense political cachet at that moment to do something which normally would be quite politically unpalatable, right? Which is say, okay, well, I'm going to work with these gangs. And but a lot of things happened at that time, which makes Ecuador quite unique. Which is one, he had, oil was at $140 a barrel, so he had tons of money he was flush with cash, so he was literally modernizing the state over a decade. But so he had tons of money to do social programs, right? The other thing that he did was to say, I'm going to expend some of this political cachet to do something that's not popular, which is because Ecuador is although it has some idiosyncrasies, it has a history of mano dura, but it doesn't have the same sort of moral panics necessarily. I think the Andes it has some. This is one of the idiosyncratic things about the Andes. You don't have the same experience as you do in Central America, for example. But he did have to overcome a lot of stigma, right? And he understood that if the state was the first one to sort of embrace a different policy, he could convince others to follow suit, right? And so, like one of the interesting things that happened in Ecuador was that they had the government, the Ministry of Culture, created a program called Paz Urbana, which was a concert, which was like a reggaeton concert that they held every year, and that was co-sponsored with the gangs. And so the first year, nobody showed up, right? But the second year, people started to trickle in. By the third, fourth year, it was one of the biggest concerts in the country. And the government really did, because a lot of times we talk about creating jobs for them, this, that. One of the big lessons of El Salvador in Ecuador in terms of creating a political space for gangs means the state has to be the first one to overcome the issue of stigma, because the more you do to overcome the stigma of working with gangs, the more easy it is for civil society, private sector, and other actors to sort of absorb and begin to work with those actors, to work with those people as well. Another thing that sort of contributed to this idea of gangs making this jump to street political actors is that you had the whole decade prior to Correa coming to power was a fight really between indigenous movements and the state. And this indigenous struggle really inculcated this idea of citizenship, right? And that you have subcultures, right? And you have and that this is a plurinational state. And the gangs really adopted this language as well to say, we're an urban subculture, right? And we also have a history of repression, and we will also want to be part of a political project. We also want to, if given the possibility to be, we would also want to sort of embark on a more pro-social path. And so I think the real lesson from Ecuador is this idea that, okay, they really took the political will was there to say, okay, let's do something different. Let's bring gangs into the political sphere. Next slide. Collective desistance. So this is perhaps one of the, if not the most important, I think, for a lot of people, the most important lesson from Ecuador. A lot of times when we talk about gangs, we talk about individual desistance. So individual member desisting from violence, leaving the gang, oftentimes what they call maturing out of the gang. Ecuador completely breaks with this idea, right? They go beyond the concept of individual desistance, and they talk about collective desistance. So the state, in many ways, this is how, when we did lots of interviews with state bureaucrats in Ecuador, and they said, listen, this is they were talking about thousands of members here. We can't do a policy that's betting on individual desistance. Like, we need to work collectively. This is, the scale of this matters, right? But it's also, they understood that the gang is identity-based, right? And that you could leverage the gang's sort of social capital. And so what they did is they said, okay, let's create a project that's collective. Let's work with the leaders. Let's work with entire groups. Also, trying to leave the gang individually oftentimes is very difficult because you're leaving your family, right? You're leaving your social group. So this idea of collectively working together is something that is it seems really innovative. I mean, it seems really novel, but it actually works. And I would also make the argument that the future of gang violence reduction in many countries will be more collective than individual. That's actually where we should put our money on. This is really infused or informed by the idea that the gangs are not monolithic. They mutate according to political and economic conditions. So they can become worse, they can become more pro-social. These things really depend on the policies that are in place, right? And the conditions that are there. A lot of desistance studies, when you look at desistance studies over the years, in the 90s, it was a lot about individual desistance, the experience of a person leaving violence behind, maturing out. But as time goes on, you see the role of wounded healers. But if you look at the work of Thomas Lebel, Shad Maroon, and now desistance studies has completely changed. It's really about looking at desistance as a movement, right? In fact, they even have studies, even looking beyond gangs, that when you have projects where people are desisting together, it's almost like an AA meeting. So it's like you're helping each other, right? So desistance has completely evolved to be more collective. And the same thing happens with the gangs. Tone will talk about this later, but he also speaks about this in the video, right? The idea that it's working with a gang is not a 9-month program. It's not we're going to work with you until you get better, or we're going to work with you individually. No, it's engaging the community. It's saying, okay, this is 24/7. We're all going to work together to change this context. So I think the idea about in the Ecuadorian case. We call this, in one of the texts that Dave and I wrote, we call it defanging the gang, right? So aesthetically, the gang, you're leveraging the gang's social capital. They are hierarchical. I mean, they have a lot of solidarity. They're hierarchical. They're organized. They work together. But you're just sort of stripping away the violent aspects of the gang, right? And we call that defanging. And that's really about understanding, if you understand that the gang has a lot of positive things about it, that they have literature, that they care about each other, that they also have a certain awareness of where they came out of, right? Out of social marginalization, out of an immigrant story, you can leverage those things. And then if you understand that the gang is identity-based, that the social matters to them, that they are collective, then you should use those to your advantage when you're designing policy. And so Ecuador, I think, really breaks with a lot of countries in looking at, because most governments are looking at gangs as an individual experience, right? Looking at gang assistance only through the individual. So this is one of the big lessons. Number 2, number 3, please. The next slide. Also, one last thing about this idea of collective assistance as well, I'll just mention one thing, is that, and this is what Dave has written quite a bit about, and what Tone has really shown, is that when you're working to individually reinsert one person, that member of a gang can easily be replaced, right? You're not doing anything to change the nature of the gang, right? So it's really, this focus on the individual is kind of short-sighted. We really need to be looking at the social ecology, but also looking at the gang, looking at what aspects, pro-social aspects, you can highlight and leverage, and then creating a political space, right? But it's recognizing that there are conditions within the gang that lend themselves to a collective process of desistance and political participation. The third thing is this idea of re-signifying with the gang. Very often when we would speak to gang members, or when they would talk to, when they would give presentations, or we would be present at ministerial meetings and they would be talking about policy, sometimes they would refer themselves as a sort of reformed gang, but oftentimes they wouldn't even use the gang name. They wouldn't use the term gang, right? So they completely changed. In Latin America, there's a very sort of long history of a long literature about clientelism, right? States using, when we think about, Peron in Argentina, also in the Andes, you have a very long history of clientelism. We make the point that, and the reason I bring this up is because a lot of times people would accuse the Ecuadorian government as, all right, this is what they're doing with the gang is really just a sort of clientelist project, right? It has all these clientelist trappings. They're giving them jobs, they're giving them scholarships, they're helping them get their GED. This is really just a way of them co-opting the gang. But we really try to challenge this narrative, right? Or this critique of the Ecuadorian experience by saying that it's not really clientelism, it's actually patronage, right? And the thing about patronage, you take this term from actually Javier Ollero's work. And the idea is really that patronage is has similarities to clientelism, but it's long-term, and it also within it has the possibility of transformation of the group that you're working with, right? So if you're having long-term commitments, if we're talking about, so clientelism would be in exchange for votes from the gang, or in exchange for something, homicide or reduction in homicide rates or something like that, I give you certain benefits, right? But in the case of the Ecuadorian model, you can't really say that happened, because it's really a patron. It's really that the state is the patron of the gang, because they're basically working past, they don't care about election cycles. They're working for well over a decade. And the idea is that the long-term wager is that the gang will actually transform. And so what we really see is that over people often say, okay, well, how long does it take to really change the habits of these gang members, right? To change some of these guys are have a really complicated past, or have really complicated records. And I think Ecuador poses a sort of interesting example, because it's, after a decade, you see sustained homicide reductions, but you also see the emergence of different actors within the gang. So the first time I went down to Ecuador, Tone and Dave invited me down, and I came from El Salvador because I was really interested in seeing an example of a Latin American country, a state that was engaging on a national level politically with different gangs in a way that was successful. And one of my first meetings was in the Interior Ministry with the number 2 and different gang leaders. And so you had the emergence of sort of different actors within the gang that became formalized actors. So when I spoke about before, when Correa was saying, okay, in order for us to work with you guys, you need to be able to sit down with the state. And so you had gang members that got their masters, you had gang members that were able to write, proposals to get funding from the state for different projects. You really saw them having a totally different sort of language. And I think this resignification of the gang in Ecuador, it was extremely resilient as well, because even with Lenin Moreno, as many of you would know, he succeeded Correa's 10-year term, and 2 terms of 10 years, and he totally broke with Correa. And even though and they also had a very, oil prices had completely bombed, and basically the state had no money, and the last thing they were going to do was sort of invest in gang reentry programs. And so all of these projects sort of fell to the wayside, but gangs never sort of went back to how things were. They never wanted to sort of go back to, okay, filling prisons and looking over their shoulder. And so I think, if you really work with them to try something else, and you have a long-term commitment and you have a long-term strategy, not only can you work to substitute illicit rent-seeking strategies, but you can really change habits of the gang, right? And the gang begins to create all these different connections, right? They have different connections with universities, with different ministries, with other social groups. A lot of times I would meet with a gang leader and he said, oh, I just came from a meeting where we met with, some other youth group or some other social movement that was also working on a certain legislation. I remember one time I went to a meeting at one ministry, and you had gang representatives, you had representatives of the LGBT community, you had all these representatives of different subgroups, of different sort of subcultures within Quito, and they were working on legislation together. So they began to be exposed to all these other ideas, and they began to see themselves differently and use a different language, right? But this is only possible if the state looks beyond sort of short-term political settlements, right? It has to be a long-term commitment. Which is only possible very often when you have a government or a series of presidents or terms where they're thinking along the same terms, right? So along the same lines. Fourth slide, please. The rule of law. So like I said before, very often this is sort of seen as a very lofty term. What do we mean exactly by the rule of law? And what does this mean to the gang member? One of the things I wanted to say about Ecuador, it's no coincidence that gang legalization was so effective. It's because it also happened to take place simultaneously with police reform. It's another sort of success story in Ecuador that hasn't really been spoken about. But Ecuador had a complete, again, it had, during the time of Correa, had so much money because the oil prices were so high that they really had money to do whatever they wanted. And they quadrupled the salary of police officers. They completely changed their curriculum. They hired tons of new police officers. They had a completely different set of, a pool of people to draw from. They created completely different infrastructure. 80% of police officers in Ecuador now are community police officers. Obviously, there's definitely some critiques of the police, which we certainly talk about in the question and answer period. But for the most part, this police reform really helped to sort of work together in tandem with gang legalization, and because the police became stakeholders, right? But they also were part of a political project to try to rethink security as a sort of development project. So they understood, they were privy to this idea that, okay, we're trying to treat the gang issue differently. I wanted to sort of tell one anecdote. I remember one time I was in Turubamba, which is in the south side of Quito, which is sort of is seen as the sort of territory of the Latin Kings, right? It's synonymous with them. It's one of the places that one of their strongholds when they came to Ecuador, and it's one of the places where a lot of their members live. And I was doing field work with a group, and I was hanging out with them till late one evening. And then at one point I got a cab home, and then I got a text early that morning saying that they had been attacked by a sort of local gang that had not been in any legalized. It hadn't been legalized. It wasn't in a process of. It wasn't working with the government, right? And it was trying to make a name for themselves by attacking the Kings, right? Which is by far the largest gang, or has the most amount of members on a national level. And one of the guys I knew, one of this rival gang, basically, they broke a bottle over his face and ripped out one of his eyes. And when this guy texted me in the morning, I thought, okay, well, this is the moment of truth. For surely, they're going to take care of this guy extrajudicially, and they're not going to let this one slide. But to my surprise, they, I said, well, so what did you guys do? They said, well, the next day we went to the police. We wrote up a report. Obviously, they still have they still have control in the neighborhood. They still, would know what's going on. And they said they knew who it was. And the police reacted immediately, right? But the police picked up the guy and took him to prison. And he was charged. And the reason I tell the story is because for the gang, what does it mean to sort of the rule of law for the gang means that the state is also upholding their side of the bargain, right? That the state is protecting them. They've engaged in this process of reforming the gang, of a more pro-social pathway, of leaving violence behind, but they need to be protected as well, right? They need to realize that dealing with violence the legitimate way by asking the police, by going through the courts, is the only way for them to be a part of society, right? And they have to see that going to the police and asking them for help is actually benefits them, right? Is convenient for them, is actually in their interest. And they didn't see that before, right? Because the police were not treated them if the gang called the police in, of course they weren't going to answer, or they weren't going to take it seriously. So this idea that the gangs and the police can also meet halfway and they can understand each other, right? And so the police were stakeholders in this process. And I think this is one of the most important things, because oftentimes we don't see examples of this in other countries in Latin America, precisely because the police are not stakeholders. Many times they sabotage these alternative, less punitive approaches to gangs because they're not involved in the same way. So this is another really important example from Ecuador. The next slide, please. Transnationalism. So I wanted to have a slide on this briefly to talk about this idea that when we think about transnational gangs, oftentimes we think it's a pejorative, right? It can only mean negative things, right? When we think about transnational gangs, we think about the sort of transportation of illicit goods across borders and the sort of coordination between different cliques in different countries. And oftentimes they can be that, but there's also a different type of transnationalism, which we often don't think about. And this is one of the things I want to sort of challenge, right? If the gang is not pathological, if we can think about the gang differently. The Kings also provided a sort of interesting history, because the gang can also share negative things, right? Techniques or goods, but they can also share positive experiences. And they do. And I think the history of the Latin Kings is super interesting, because as you'll see with Tone's presentation, Tone started in the 90s, really tried to rethink the gang, right? To organize the gang politically, to create peace between all the different Hispanic and Black gangs in New York, and to create a different political space. That history really influenced what happened in Barcelona. You had deportees from in Barcelona. The government of Catalonia actually was the first one to legalize Nietas and Latin Kings, and to look at them as cultural groups and institute programs on a sort of regional level to work with Hispanic immigrants who were part of gangs. And this was highly successful. It was even adopted in Italy. And then you had deportees from Ecuador, Ecuadorian deportees from Europe sent back to Ecuador. And they heard about these ideas. They took part in these ideas. They participated. And so they brought it to Quito. And so Quito, you had this on a national level, you had this completely different political context, economically, political, and social, that allowed for a sort of alternative security vision to flourish. But it really, the origin story of that, if you look at the sort of, the genealogy of this idea, it didn't just, appear in the Andes. It started in New York, went to Europe, and then made its way all the way to Latin America, right? And it's shared. There's a certain institutional memory within the gang that they share these positive experiences. They share these successful experiences in other countries. Say, hey, this worked for us, it might work for you. And then you also have deportees bringing these ideas and being transporters and messengers of also more pro-social or more of different policies, of different alternatives. So this idea of transnationalism isn't always negative, right? And that the gang has a certain agency and historical awareness and institutional memory. And I remember doing my first interviews the first year I was in Ecuador, and older gang members telling me that they would use the little money they had to go to internet cafes in Quito and Guayaquil, to go on YouTube and look at the HBO documentary that had been made about King Tone in New York under Giuliani, and completely inspired and saying, oh, wow, look what he's doing in New York. We want to do that here. So this idea there, and now we're even more connected, right, through our phones. So this idea that transnationalism is always negative, I think has to really be challenged. And it's also another thing that has to be challenged is what we do in the US or what we do in El Salvador, or what we do in Ecuador, or what we do in Barcelona. These also have political impacts as well that can create, that can inform how we approach or how we create policies in other countries. So this idea of transnationalism can also have a positive element, and we should actually be leveraging that as well when we can. Next slide, please. So contingency. I really wanted to sort of bring this up because I think this is perhaps the most important concept, in my opinion, for reimagining different and more successful gang policies. When we think about this concept of deviancy amplification, which Dave might have touched upon, it's a concept that's been around for a long time in critical criminology. This idea that repression usually leads to the amplification of deviant behavior and of criminal behavior. And you see this, this is the history of Central America, essentially, right, with Mano Duda, right? The fact that you went from street gangs to crime syndicates to highly organized gangs, right? Highly armed gangs. You basically, you're creating a bigger problem, right? So this idea that there's real limits to just punitive approaches or just policing approaches or just trying to resolve the gang problem through prisons. But when you understand that this idea of contingency, that, okay, well, if we can, what does it mean to reimagine a different security landscape? What does it mean if how can these different, looking at how things played out in Chicago, in LA, in New York, in Ecuador, in San Salvador, in Barcelona, you begin to see, okay, that contingency, this is really important because the different outcomes depend on what policies we're putting into place. And then we're going to see the effects in the years to come, right? And it can be one way or it can be another way, right? You can have, you can have a Rio de Janeiro situation or you can have an LA situation, right? It really depends on the policies you put in place. And so understanding contingency, understanding how violence mutates and how it over time, depending on the different political, economic, social conditions, is the most important thing for rethinking and having a different criminological imagination. I like to always bring up an example of, there's a book by Federico Varese who talks about, the mafia in different countries. And oftentimes where you have an Italian diaspora and you had high levels of social disintegration, you also had the mafia have a stronghold, right? You have mafia in Australia, you have mafia in Scotland, you have mafia in New York, you have mafia wherever you had sort of Italian diaspora, but in Argentina, you didn't have mafia. Right, and they actually, the Sicilian mafia made they launched a massive campaign actually to try to gain a stronghold in Latin America, and they completely failed. And the reason for that was one of their big campaigns was actually in the city of not necessarily in Buenos Aires, but in Rosario, and they completely failed because the social conditions wasn't like in New York where the Italian community was, when they went to church, they had to they had to go to mass in the basement of St. Patrick's Cathedral. In Argentina, Italian diaspora was completely integrated into society, right? It was completely integrated into the social fabric. So the mafia could not gain a stronghold, right? And so when you understand how crime and how gangs fluctuate over time and space, and where they find spaces that are perfect conditions for them to flourish, and other conditions where they don't flourish, that really, what it comes down to is this idea of contingency. And the Ecuadorians, I think, really exemplified this because when we sat down with the Ministry of Interior or with police chiefs or with policymakers of the Correa government, they said, listen, we learned the lessons of Central America. Mano dura is not going to work, and we don't have as big of a problem as they do. Our biggest problem is actually organized crime in cartels, because we're in between the two major coca producing countries in Latin America. We're in between Colombia and Peru. And really what we want to do is to embark on a project of deterrence, because we really don't want the gangs to have stronger contacts with organized crime. So we don't want them mixing in prisons. We don't want to push the gang further and further towards organized crime. We think that we have a lot to offer the gang. So the Ecuadorian government was actually, soft on crime with gangs and really hard policies towards cartels. But that really worked. But it was this idea of deterrence that was informed by a concept of contingency, understanding the history of the gang, understanding how you can amplify your problems, right? By only having the only tool in your toolbox being policing or being repressive measure. And then I'll end with the last slide, which is about the role of educators. I really want to say this because many of you guys listening are professors or school teachers. And really the history of reimagining gangs in Ecuador was completely led by educators. Dave working with Tone in New York as a professor. In Ecuador, it was two universities that played a massive role. Flaxo, in fact, two professors at Flaxo were the ones that were the sort of intellectual architects of the legalization process, who worked closely with Correa's government, who actually hosted a lot of the sort of initial meetings with the gangs. And then later the Pontificia, which is the PUSE in Quito, currently has several programs working with Latin kings. This was completely led by educators, right? And it was really thinking, higher education, but also high schools and middle schools. These are not just spaces of critical thinking or knowledge production, but they're also spaces of political alternatives. So really trying to do different things, giving the example themselves, not just writing papers about what different things we could do with the gang. It was actually saying, okay, inviting gang members to go to school. In the PUSE, for example, you have several gang leaders who work in government who actually received all their education there, went to college, then got master's degrees. You have, for example, at the PUSE, they created a entrepreneurship hub for the Latin kings. So they create all these small businesses for them. All of the catering, if you ever go to an event in Quito from the Jesuits, they hire Latin kings to cook for them. It was the role of education was crucial. It was the bedrock. Education, the teachers and professors were always at side by side with trying to lead a different political process with the gangs. So I wanted to end on that note, just to say that the role of schools was crucial to not only rethinking a different criminological imagination, a different political context where gang violence is reduced sustainably, but also a place to actually put into practice these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafa. Thank you for the excellent presentation.